Hi guys, Olive here today to talk to you about what I read in March of 2018. I was really surprised when I went to go and look at my Goodreads to see how many books I had read in March that I managed to finish 7 books, even considering how hectic my life was. It was a little bit of a mixed bag of a month. Most of the books I read I really enjoyed, but 2 I found rather mediocre. So let's start to talk about them. The first book I finished in March was Middlemarch by George Eliot. This was my pick off of my 2018 Classics TBR. I had been wanting to read another George Eliot novel since I read and really enjoyed The Mill on the Floss last year. This was the most obvious pick for a George Eliot novel to read after I finished The Mill on the Floss because everyone says it is her masterpiece. But I was really intimidated by this book because everyone says it is her masterpiece and also because it is so enormously long. It's really hard to say what this book is about. I know everyone always summarizes this book by saying it is about a young girl named Dorothea who is in an unhappy marriage, and then when that husband dies, there is a stipulation in his will that prevents her from marrying the man that she actually loves. But Dorothea's story is just one piece of the massive jigsaw puzzle that is this novel. This book is titled Middlemarch, and rightly so, because we come to know a whole cast of characters who are living in the town of Middlemarch. We come to know this town and its inhabitants intimately over this sprawling, dramatic tale. I got a lot, and I mean a lot, of comments on my Classics TBR video of people telling me just how boring they found Middlemarch. Like, they were very angry about it. I could feel the anger from here, and I'm on this side of the internet. I'm not saying this is the most thrilling book I've ever read. It was certainly slow-moving and was filled with descriptions and a lot of musings. But I found it beautiful and really touching. George Eliot has this presence on the page. She so effortlessly weaves the story while injecting just the right amount of wit and whimsy. She has this way of yo-yoing in and out of characters' perspectives, allowing you to see things through their eyes, but then so quickly, like a spider up a web, pulls away from that and goes right back into impartial narration. That method allows a reader to see each character's intimate perspective without detracting at all from the big picture. Even from the 2 books I've read of hers so far, I have a strong suspicion that George Eliot is going to become one of my favorite authors, and I'm not even really someone who does favorite authors. Overall, I really enjoyed this book, and while I didn't fall as head over heels in love with it as I expected to and wanted to, it is certainly something I want to revisit in the future, and I certainly cannot wait to pick up another George Eliot book because I really feel as though one of my future favorite books is within her catalog. The next book I finished in March ties into the previous book, and that is My Life in Middlemarch by Rebecca Mead. This is a nonfiction book that I originally believed to be a memoir about Rebecca Mead's connection to her favorite novel, Middlemarch. It sort of was that, and also sort of not. Rebecca Mead is a journalist, and she uses her background and her skills to examine the content and the creation of the novel Middlemarch, but also takes a look at George Eliot's life and looks at the inspiration for all of George Eliot's work. This book talks about George Eliot's writing process, her relationships, and what all she drew upon from her own life that she put into her work. This book is told with so much love because Rebecca Mead really cherishes the work of George Eliot. She goes to places that George Eliot, who was born Mary Ann Evans, lived and worked during her lifetime. She looks at her manuscripts and sees the minor alterations that she made to the text before publication. She manages to give a fully fleshed out portrait of the novelist while digging into the themes of her works, particularly Middlemarch, of course. I found this whole book to be full of great insights. I found it downright lovely, and it is certainly a great companion piece to read alongside Middlemarch. Now oscillating from 2 books that I really enjoyed to 2 that I enjoyed much less, the first of those being The French Girl by Lexie Eliot. This is a new release thriller about a young professional woman whose past has come back to haunt her. 10 years prior to the events in this book, Kate and a group of her university friends go on holiday to France. While they are there, a French girl living in the house next door named Séverine goes missing and is presumed dead. Fast forward to the present day, and Severine's body has been found by French police. The detective investigating the case is interested in interviewing the whole gang again, and wouldn't you know it, they're all conveniently back in London for the first time in many years. Obviously, the detective suspects that one of our crew murdered Séverine, although all of them seemingly have alibis. My tone may give the wrong impression. I did not hate this book. Obviously, I finished it. I found something worthwhile to keep me going. That something was the main character, Kate. A lot of this book is focused on Kate and her efforts to keep her legal headhunting business afloat. That is to say, for lack of a better term, that there's a lot of grown-ass woman shit in this book. As a fellow grown-ass woman, I really enjoyed reading about her hustle. But there were so many problems with this book. The first being that one of the suspects is having a physical relationship with the detective investigating the case. Our main character is continuously hallucinating the French girl who died, Séverine, yet we don't learn anything about who Séverine was. And that highlights what I found to be the main flaw of this book. The entire thing takes place in the present day. There are absolutely zero flashbacks back to 10 years prior to the events of this book when this crime actually occurred. How am I expected as a reader to engage with the events of this novel if you don't describe them to me in detail or give me any kind of a flashback? This was a surface level book during the entire reading experience, and it was so mild of a thriller that I feel really uncomfortable using that word to describe it. And the other book that I ended up being not that fond of was Standard Deviation by Katherine Haney. I first received this book from the publisher, Fourth Estate, quite a while ago when they sent me this as a bonus book, when they sent me The Party by Elizabeth Day. I was immediately intrigued by the premise of this book. Years after leaving his stoic, rather cold first wife, Elspeth, for his gregarious second wife, Audra, our narrator, Graham, starts to strike up a friendship with his first wife, Elspeth, with the knowledge, consent, and enthusiasm of his second wife, I should note. Meanwhile, Graham and Audra are doing their best to effectively parent their son, who is on the autism spectrum. I believe they say he has Asperger's, who is obsessed with origami. To say that Graham's second wife, Audra, has a big personality would be a nearly criminal understatement. She almost is too big of a personality to not be at the center of this book. Any chance she gets to overdo it, she does so. She inserts herself into everyone's business. She invites total strangers to come and live in her family home. She has no issue telling lies to get exactly what she wants. Basically, she's the type of person that I would want to punch in the throat if I met her in real life. But on the page, she's really entertaining, although very cringy. And it's a good thing she's entertaining because she runs this novel. This is a novel about that character. Everything else is a backdrop done infinitely less effectively. This author had so many opportunities to make interesting points or observations, especially with the juxtaposition between Elspeth's and Audra's characters, and with the condition of Graham and Audra's son. It's almost like Katherine Haney lost control of the momentum of this book. We're moving along and she's like, oh, something important happened back there, but we're full speed ahead on the Audra train, so I guess that's just going to sit back there unexplored. Oh well. There is one particular very important and tragic event that happens in this book that I thought would add some weight to this story because something like that would force these characters to introspect. But do they? Nope. It happens, gets a brief acknowledgement, and then isn't really mentioned again. I found this to be a superficial, trite book that I felt so let down by. I am losing my daylight. I haven't relied on natural light for a while. The remaining 3 books that I read in March I enjoyed infinitely more, the first being Smarter, Faster, Better, The Secrets of Being Productive in Life and Business by Charles Duhigg. This was my pick off of my Young Professional TBR for the month, and I was inspired to put this book on that list in the first place because The Power of Habit was on my previous Young Professional TBR, and it ended up being one of my favorite nonfiction books of 2016. I had some pretty high expectations of this book going in, and it definitely did not disappoint. I absolutely loved it. This book is supposedly about how to make yourself more productive, but I found it very similar to The Power of Habits in that it's teaching you more about your own psychology so that you can work with that psychology and better yourself. To teach you these pieces of psychology, he relies heavily on anecdotes, which he tells in the most engaging way that I've ever seen done in nonfiction. He explains what makes your brain react the way that it does, but he gives you methods that you can use to retain control. There were 2 stories in particular that really stuck with me in this book, both about plane crashes, one that was fatal and one that landed safely. In that section, he's mainly talking about the differences in reactions from the crew. I can remember very few times where I've ever been as riveted reading nonfiction as I was when I was reading those stories. I was seriously on the edge of my seat. The whole thing was was definitely great food for thought. It's something that I recommend highly and really want to revisit. The penultimate book that I finished in March was Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doughty. Before I start talking about this book, I will say that this is a book that I had planned to read during the month of March. And then a member of my family passed away. After that happened, I was really on the fence about whether or not I wanted to proceed with my plans to read this book. But I determined that I thought it would be a good idea for me to read this. I thought it would be a good idea to read this book because up to this point in my life, I have been fortunate enough to not have a whole lot of encounters with death. But because of that, it is something that I'm really unfamiliar with. I'm not used to talking about it. I'm not used to thinking about it. And I needed some help. I did have to pace myself with this book. Sometimes it was a little more than I could handle at any one time, but I respected my own boundaries. This has been a very popular piece of nonfiction on BookTube over the past few years. This is a memoir written by Caitlin Doughty. She has her own channel here on YouTube called Ask a Mortician, and she works in the death industry. In this book, she recounts her introduction to death when she was just a child, how she developed macabre interests, and ultimately how she came to work at a crematory in the Bay Area of San Francisco. Throughout the book, we hear a lot of funny, disturbing, but also illuminating anecdotes about her time working in the death industry. She shares her thoughts about our cultural opinions about death and dying and how we all want to distance ourselves from the whole affair. Interestingly, she says it is our fear of death that keeps us so fixated on youth. And even though humans seem very interested in gaining immortality, she credits all human creativity on our mortality. The fact that we expire, that there is an expiration date, drives us to create. She is also very for all of us having more open, regular conversations about death, and is a big proponent of what she calls the good death, one that is much more natural and much less commercialized. As I was talking about before, with a little bit of awkward timing when it came to me deciding to read this book, I honestly felt really comforted by it. I am not saying that this wasn't a difficult book for me to read. At times it was very difficult and I had to take breaks. This book brought a sense of normalcy about talking about death and dying into my life when I really needed that. I had had no prior basis about how to even talk about death before. It does sound really weird, but I kind of felt that I got to talk about it with Caitlin Doughty by reading this book. I know even after explaining that, a lot of you are probably still going to find it weird that I read this book after losing someone I really cared about. And that's fine. You can find me weird. I'm INTJ. I get it. But regardless of the very weird timing, this is a fantastic book and I highly recommend you read it. And the last book that I finished in March was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a book that I kept hearing about on BookTube. People whose opinions that I really trust raved about this book, and I knew that I was going to love it. The situation with me reading this book was kind of similar to the situation of me reading The Unseen Worlds, in that I was very confident that I was going to love it, so I wanted to save it for a time where I needed a slam dunk. And this book delivered. I read it all in one day. The title does describe the very core of this novel. There was a famous golden age of Hollywood actress, Evelyn Hugo, who was married 7 times. She has been notoriously private over her lifetime, never granting interviews. And then all of a sudden one day, she calls up a famous magazine and requests by name a rookie journalist to come to her house to be interviewed about a collection of dresses that she had donated for charity. This ends up being a ruse. Evelyn Hugo actually wants this journal to write her biography to be published after her death. For the first time ever to anyone, Evelyn Hugo is going to tell her story about her life, making it big in Hollywood, her infamous 7 husbands, and much more. This book has somewhat of a dual narrative. We are hearing from the journalist writing the biography, who was in the middle of a divorce herself, and then we are hearing sort of from Evelyn. We know that it is still this journalist writing her story, but it is Evelyn's story being told. It is so hard for me not to divulge some of the themes of this book, but if I did that, it would give away some really great parts of the story, and I just can't do that. But I will say throughout this book, you come to know Evelyn Hugo intimately. You see all her talents and her flaws. You see the way that she's ferocious, but also irresistible at the same time. How she's unapologetic and yet highly self-critical at the exact same time. She's this complex, layered character that I believe to be a real person. And all of the movies that are described that she supposedly starred in feel like real movies. Like, I want to go and watch one of her movies this weekend. I wish that was possible. I wish they actually existed. And while you're reading Evelyn Hugo's fascinating, captivating story, there is the lingering question: why did she ask for this nobody journalist by name? All that I can really add at this point is to say that this book is worth all of the hype, and if this premise sounds even remotely interesting to you, pick it up. This book is brilliant. So those are all of the books that I read in March. I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these books, if you've heard about them, if you're now interested in reading them after hearing me talk about them. You can put that or any other comments or questions you may have down in the comment section below, or you can find me on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles are linked in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.